that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she built planets on Earth, you guys.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Science Boston and our very special program tonight, the Colby Room, Cultural Institutions, Colonialism, and Our Cultural Reckoning. I'm James Monroe. I'm the senior producer of adult programs and theater experiences here at the museum, but tonight I have the privilege of welcoming you all to this important evening of conversation. Tonight we're so lucky to have with us not only voices from our museum team here, but three of our trusted consultants who have begun this work with us, reinterpreting the Colby Room, a long-standing exhibit here at the museum. And tonight they're going to join together on stage in dialogue to share with all of you about that reinterpretation work, as well as decolonization work that's happening across our industry and why it's so important. And so I just wanted to kick tonight off with a huge thank you to our guest speakers, some of which came to Boston specifically tonight for this conversation. I can't wait for you to meet all of them, but a huge, huge thank you to all of them for being here. And tonight is a part of our current winter-spring season of adult programming. We still have about a month and a half left, a really great lineup still to go. So I encourage you to pick up our season mailer on your way out tonight, or check out our website at mos.org/adults and come and spend the rest of your spring with us. Now, after the conversation this evening, our speakers will have a chance to take questions from all of you. So you can submit that in two ways tonight. The first, if you're watching with us at home or if you're here in the audience, you can pull out those smartphones or go on your computer and go to slido.com and enter the code Colby Room, all one word, just as it appears on the screen now. Otherwise, if you're here in person and you're able to, at that point, we will bring two microphones in either aisle here. We encourage you to come down and ask your question out loud. I need to thank our friends from the Lowell Institute for making tonight possible and for their ongoing support of the adult programming here at the museum. It is because of them that we are all here tonight and that this event is free for all of you. So a huge thank you to everyone at the Lowell Institute. But now it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage our first special guest for the evening. To kick us off, please welcome the president of the Museum of Science Boston, 𝗤𝘂𝗁𝘁𝗂𝗏.
Thank you, James. And thank you, everybody, for coming for this important conversation you're going to be a part of. And also, James, I'd just like to thank you once again. The Subspace program has begun to occupy a really central place in the life of the museum. This is where we can curate these important conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, conversations where you come out of it and you realize, oh, I didn't realize things were that way. I didn't realize that the reality looked like that. And so you can emerge from these programs as changed people. And perhaps the museum will emerge from this very long conversation as a changed institution. So you are participating in an ongoing conversation. The consultants you'll hear from tonight have really become our guides, our mentors. They are beginning to think about how to think about the Colby Room. That's how to think about it is the first part, and then what to do about it is the second part. You're in the middle of that journey. And as James said, other museums are having similar conversations about problematic exhibits. So I would like you to think about everything you hear about and look at everything you hear tonight through a particular lens. And it's the lens of the ethical imagination. The imagination tells us what can be. The ethical imagination tells us what should be. And we think about what is right, what is respectful, what is wise, what is compassionate. These are the kinds of things that inform the ethical imagination. So as you listen to the conversation tonight, know that that's where the museum is coming from as well. This is the kind of conversation we want to have. Well, speaking of lenses, all three of our panelists tonight, our consultants, our friends, have different lenses through which they're looking at things. We have 𝗤𝗂𝗏, who is an equity consultant with Arts Connect International. She is local here to Boston. She's an arts activist. She's very involved with music and visual medium. She's a performing artist herself, a fabulous musician, and she is a seasoned partner with the Boston Children's Chorus this year. We have Laurie Halderman, Vice President of Exhibitions at the American Museum of Natural History. She's been at AMNH for 25 years. And we have 𝗖𝗂𝗏𝗆𝗏, who is the Associate Professor at York University in Toronto. He focuses on knowledge production in general and has done a lot of research, crucially for this conversation, in East Africa. And then to curate the conversation, to be the moderator, is our own Chief People Officer, 𝗖𝗂𝗹𝗁𝘆. 𝗖𝗂 comes to us for 20 years of experience in education and human resources and is really leading. She's our first Chief People Officer, really leading the institution in thinking about these kinds of conversations about how we relate to our community and how we relate to ourselves. And with that, I'd like all four of our panelists to come to join us on the stage.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, James, and thank you all for coming this evening. I've got my notes here. These are extensive notes. We've got some great conversations and some experts and collaborators and co-creators that are really going to help us through this. And as Tim said, this is a conversation that we need to have and a conversation that we can have. And it's just such a great place to have it at the Museum of Science, especially talking about the Colby Room. So as Tim mentioned, my name is 𝗖𝗂𝗹𝗁𝘆. I am the Chief People Officer here, and I get to work around human resources. I also get to work around a lot of our initiatives around diversity, equity, inclusion, and of course, that sense of belonging. And when we talk about the Colby Room here, a lot of the work that has been done in the museum also is really researching that sense of belonging when people come from other parts of the world, when people come from other neighborhoods in Boston, and what that sense is when going through that particular exhibit. So we might be thinking about why now, and we might be thinking about what comes next and how we're going to curate this conversation tonight and how we're going to curate the work that we do forward. So we felt that the time was right now because it's really about the museum community, and we've been receiving comment cards and receiving from staff as well as from our community to figure out what it is that we can do. So we're joined by our expert tonight, so we're going to have them talk a little bit about themselves and their work, their expertise, and then how they've been collaborating with us. So we'll start with you, Laurie, to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work.
Sure. Well, I'm Laurie Halderman from the American Museum of Natural History, and I head up the exhibition team there. One of our great privileges is we make new exhibitions, but in historic museums. Our museum celebrated its 150th anniversary not too long ago. We often update older exhibits, and some of those exhibits are problematic. So we think of I think museums used to imagine that we were kind of encyclopedic voices of knowledge, and all we needed to do was just communicate the truth. And I think we've really understood that our roles have shifted, that now we embrace many different voices and perspectives. And part of our work is having the dialogue with all of our stakeholders and understanding some of these older exhibits and how we might come to terms with them. So it's exciting to have a chance to look at the Colby Room as an exhibit that is one of those.
Dr. on to you.
Yeah, thanks, 𝗖𝗂𝗹𝗁𝘆. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And I come to this project as an expert on coastal East Africa, where most of my research has been conducted. But it's also the place I was born. I was born in Kenya. I came to Canada in 1972 as a political refugee from Uganda. And when I arrived in Canada, and for most of my life, I found that the stories that Canada has told about its various populations has been fairly limited. And as part of my work as an anthropologist working in a university setting, it's to open up new conversations about the Canadian experience. And mine in particular has been quite interesting. As a refugee, coming to Canada, I was often asked about Africa. Oh, did you ride elephants? Did you wear no shoes? And a whole range of stereotypes about people from different parts of the world, as you probably have here in the United States as well. So I think what the Colby Room project has done is actually bring me back home in many ways, because I think the kinds of objects in there, the kinds of stories it can tell, can really help to, as a very important exhibition within this museum, can afford to tell new stories, different stories. And I must quote here one of my favorite authors, a Nigerian author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she tells she says, the problem with stereotypes is it's not that they're not true, it's that they're incomplete. And I think that that's really what I'm hoping that we can think about in terms of the Colby Room, is how to tell more complete stories about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have to
𝗖cie𝗹𝗯𝘆.
follow that, huh?
Yeah.
I don't have a quote. Hey, everyone. I'm 𝗖cie𝗹𝗯𝘆. I am an arts activist. I'm also a racial equity consultant through Arts Connect International. And I've had the honor of doing various work with the museum, including a show that we can put the
Oh, yes.
the slide on. Yes, I did a show here at the end of 2021 using my music to tell the story from the perspective of an ancient African artifact about decolonizing museums and what that means, and the role of the arts in helping us do things like this, right? And then I've also had the honor of working alongside the museum in a consulting capacity, participating in a 𝗖𝘂𝗹𝗯𝘆 program to reassess various programming that the museum puts on through the lens of equity and creative justice, and also having this conversation about the Colby Room, beginning to think of what it looks like to reimagine. And I think this is an important thing because it's about the Colby Room, but it's also bigger than the Colby Room, right? And it's an example for all of us of how to move forward. So, yes.
Thank you so much. Your introductions, just hearing you, we were able to spend a little time before you all came and to get to know each other a little bit. And I love how all of your perspectives are so important when we're talking about collaboration and we're talking about co-creation, and all of their expertise in different areas makes a really great, complete story. Just like what you were saying, that is really important. And it's not, and to your point, Lori, too, I know I grew up thinking the museums had it all right and the museums knew everything. So it is really about being open and learning how to tell that story. So I really, I loved that. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. So before we dive into the conversation, we've got questions, and hopefully, as James mentioned as well, you're able to ask questions as we go along in Slido. We do have some terms for the evening. I don't expect that we're going to read these to you, but I just think it's important that you all know that we are working under an understood definition of words. So here we have colonialism. We have about 6 words for us this evening, and that's the premise. We had a foundation. This is what we all understand these words to mean. And this is colonialism, is about that system. I'm going to go through them, but I don't expect you to memorize them. You're not going to be quizzed later on, but I do want to make sure that you understand that that's where we're discussing. So colonialism as well, and it's about making sure that we are on the same ground here. Decolonization is also very important, understanding that meaning as well. And we really want to be, especially when we're talking about these, and you guys can chime in as well, these words are really important too. And when we're doing this work, when we're talking about decolonization, it's really about having this respect too, of understanding. I'm just going to go back to your point of telling the whole story. And that people come in with their story, they come in with the knowledge that they know, and that can be very challenging. Co-creation. The Museum of Science is very committed to co-creation. And of course, the work that we do with Subspace is a lot about that. It's a lot about understanding how we're telling stories in that way. Reinterpretation of exhibits, that's what brought us here today as well. We're looking at this. And there are many more. And I love that your point too, 150-year young institution such as yourself. Ours is 193 years young. So there's a lot of history there, for sure. And then repatriation as well. This is something that for some people is a little newer, that we're working towards. And again, having conversations. Of course, this is happening across the city of Boston, and this is happening across the nation as well. And they're conversations and really figuring out where people fit in these conversations. Oh, sorry. This is temperamental. That's okay. So those are some of the images of, some of the definitions. Now we're going to go to images. This is the Colby Room. And as I expressed before, we all met there. That was my first time physically in the Colby Room because it is has the glass doors that can see it from the outside. But to be in that room, we each noticed something very different. Doctor, you had noticed that there was a license plate off to the side that none of us noticed. And someone was talking about noticing some helmets too. There's something that's always a little different when you go in there. It's filled with so much information. So Colonel Colby was born in Boston, and he was a direct descendant of Miles Standish. He graduated from Harvard University in 1905. This is just some information that we have about him. He graduated from law school from Boston University in 1912. Some more images of the room. Now, Tim, I just want to ask a clarifying question. The glass doors, and James, the glass doors that are there now, those were they always there with the entire room? Do we know that? Okay, I was just curious if the glass doors were there to protect the artifacts, or if it was a COVID. They were placed for COVID? No. Oh, they were there for protecting the artifacts. Okay, great. Thank you. I've been here for a year and a half, and sometimes when you see things, is this a COVID? Is this pre-COVID? Is this post-COVID? So thank you for that. During his lifetime, there's Colonel Colby there. During his lifetime, he has traveled to many different areas: England, India, Sri Lanka, Japan, Alaska, Hawaii, Kenya. And here we have the doors, not the glass doors, the doors that we would love to talk, the doors of Witu. Am I pronouncing that correctly? The doors of Witu. And again, I had the pleasure of hearing you speak is so intricately about the design and understanding the signature of the artist and really understanding that work. So we would love to turn this over to you and talk a little bit about the doors. And do you have some slides as well?
Yeah.
Do we start here?
That's perfect. Yeah. No.
And then you get the temperamental. It's not going to be temperamental for you.
Okay. Terrific. So the doors that are on the Colby Room, through a series of investigations, I figured out that they were carved by an artist whose name is 𝗔𝗓𝗄𝗎𝗓. And I'll come to him in a minute, but just to give you a quick background, the Sultanate of Witu, where the doors came from, the last palace of the Sultanate, was located on coastal Kenya near a place you might be familiar with, Lamu. Well, some of you may have heard of this very famous town. Its sultans came from a place called Pate Island. They were exiled there in the beginning of the 19th century, so in the early 1800s. And they were exiled there by the Sultan of Zanzibar, who came from Oman. Now, in order to kind of survive, they set up a rival sultanate in Witu on the mainland. The people that you see on the screen there, seated in chairs, are the people from Pate Island, and you can see how terrific they look with these fantastic chairs on which they're seated. There's a portrait there of both the men and the women from one part of Pate Island. Pate Island was an extremely important, thriving port city. It had a very thriving port city and was trading all over the Western Indian Ocean. And its people also produced amazing artifacts and objects, some of which have survived and others which have not. When the sultans were exiled to Witu and they set up this kind of settlement there, in the latter part of the 19th century, they became a thorn in the side of the British, who were working with the Sultanate of Zanzibar to get rid of this rival sultanate because they were controlling the ivory trade. So what had happened at that time was, of course, the scramble for Africa. And the European powers, Britain and Germany in particular, were fighting for control over this land. And the sultans of Witu established good relations with the Germans, and the British didn't like that either. So they set out to get rid of them through these punitive expeditions. And you might have heard of these punitive expeditions that were supported by Queen Victoria at the time, which also were led against the Kingdom of Benin, and you've heard about the Benin bronzes. It's a similar situation with the Sultanate of Witu. They got rid of them, and the middle picture shows that expedition in 1893 that was undertaken and then advertised in the Illustrated London News. One of the last sultans of Witu, who is pictured on the right, far right, is seated in his chair, and he was particularly problematic and was called the rebel sultan. So there was a lot of propaganda around him. Once the Sultanate fell after two punitive expeditions, the objects from that Sultanate were dispersed all over the world. Three objects in particular that we know of were a Quran, which found its way to the Royal Asiatic Society in London. Another object found its way to the British Museum, the chair in the middle, and a pair of sandals that were allegedly owned by the Sultan of Witu, found their way to the Brooklyn Museum, which is kind of strange if you think about it. And then the last palace doors found their way here to the Colby Room. Let me go back and just, it is temperamental.
It is temperamental.
Here is 𝗔𝗂𝗏, who is the person who carved the doors which are in the Colby Room. I must just say that the last palace of the Sultanate of Witu was actually a very impoverished place. It was actually in what then was known as British East Africa. So it was incorporated into the colonial state. And 𝗔𝗏𝗏, the artist there, is known to have carved many doors in the region of Lamu. He was commissioned by the sultans of Witu to carve those doors and other objects, including the tombstones of the sultans. And we know that it's him who did this work because on the post, the door post, we see his signature there carved in Arabic, but Swahili in Arabic script. And the top in the ovals shows his signature, master or fundi, and his name, 𝗔𝗏𝗏, in the top of the spearhead. So this is a story that is incredible to tell. We actually have the name of the artist, and we can trace back that history of those doors to his artistic expertise. And what's really, really interesting is that 𝗔𝗏𝗏 is known locally to be a master craftsman, an artist, a musician, a manuscript producer, and many craftspeople in Lamu today revere him as their ancestor because there's a continued crafts tradition of carving doors all over coastal East Africa and in Lamu in particular. So he's a real sort of touchstone for them when they think about his style of carving and the kinds of products that he produced. So that's a little bit about the doors of Witu and their history.
Thank you. And when we talk about the doors too, I believe you were talking about that they were purchased.
Yes. So
by Colby, purchased by Colby.
Yes, absolutely. So the museum has the records which show that when the Sultanate of Witu had become part of the state, part of the British East African state, these doors were sitting on a palace wall. It was like a big house, in fact. And Colby had been traveling back and forth to East Africa for a number of years. And he really wanted a pair of so-called elephant doors because it has these characteristic brass bosses. And so he wrote to his friend, whose name was 𝗏𝗏𝗏, and he said, I'd like to have a pair of these doors. Where can we find them? And so we have correspondence which shows that 𝗏𝗏𝗏 suggested 3 options or 4 options, and he chose these. And they were purchased, and we have the purchase records, that these doors were actually taken off the walls of the palace, not by force, but through a sale contract. And so, yes, he did purchase them, and that was I believe, in the 1950s. So they had been on the wall for the house for quite some time. Yeah.
And I mean, it's curious to me about when they're being purchased and when we're looking at this work and we're tracing back and you were looking at the documentation. what does it mean to reclaim that, or how far back do we go? And those are some conversations as well. Because I remember when we were learning this as a team here at the museum, okay, great, they were purchased. Now we understand they weren't taken by force, but was it his right to purchase? How do we understand that piece?
I think that's a great question. And I would just say that the issue for me thinking about this is that that British East Africa was a particular location which created the conditions under which those doors could be purchased. The British didn't regard that history as important to them because it wasn't their history they were telling. And I think that for me is the complicating factor here. Yes, there's a legal bill of sale, there's all that. But the other thing is that the Sultanate of Witu doesn't exist anymore. And the Swahili communities, the Swahili Muslim communities that would, in a sense, would be the people to whom this history matters the most, have had various kinds of relationships with the Kenyan state. And so I think partly it's a question of how to think about those doors in relation to the conditions which made it possible for a person like Colonel Colby to go there and to purchase those doors, and without any real questions from the local community who under the British East African state didn't have an opportunity to sort of comment or voice their concerns about this heritage being, taken out of the location from where they were to a different country. Would that same process happen today? Probably not, right? Because the conditions are now different. People have a voice. There's a different kind of set of arrangements. So I think that there's a lot to be thinking about in that regard with respect to that kind of historical moment when certain histories were valued over others, and those objects then had the possibility to travel where they probably wouldn't do so today.
Right. Yeah. And I do find that fascinating. I do find that, and that's where the work takes us. And I didn't talk a little bit about the room itself. And I just have some facts here too, that the Colby Room was gifted to the museum the room came with an endowment. And that endowment defrays some costs to keep the room together and some staff salaries. And there's a long-standing contract and agreement with Colby and his direct descendants. We've been talking about the focus of the past 10 years of increasing accessibility and the construction of the room. The preparation for the room began in 1953, and the room officially opened in January of 1965. Just to give you a little bit of that information. 𝗖cie and 𝗠laurie, just talking to you both a little bit about, can you share your perspectives on the room and the collections and what the room might represent to you all? 𝗖cie, you want to start with us?
I have thoughts.
Yes.
Yes, I have thoughts.
And I like how we were just checking each other. That's another thought. We're learning as we're on this stage.
Yes. So I remember that for me, when I first entered the room, my first thought is, what is this doing in a science museum? And I think there are a number of implications behind that. The first is just when I think of a science museum, I think of, okay, this is a place where I could potentially learn about animals and the cool things about them, and we want to maybe, keep them alive. And so walking into a room where I'm seeing all of these hunted animals was kind of like, oh, okay, this is what? That was my initial gut reaction. Also, it can be very triggering just from the perspective of seeing that as a celebration or prize of sorts reminds me of conquest. And it reminds me of the same mentality that encouraged groups of people to think, okay, this isn't your land, I'll take what I want, and including people, and just, do what I want. So I wasn't a big fan of that. And also, I think in a larger sense for me, forgive me for saying, the room kind of, for me, it reminds me of how another celebration of white mediocrity. Because I don't know who this man was, I don't know what he did, but yet because he was white and had the money to do it, he was able to secure this legacy for himself, to put him in this legitimate space, because museums carry all the things that we deem important in society, the things that we deem culturally valuable. And so with his money, he was able to secure space in this institution that says something about what we value. And we got to unpack what that means.
That is a lot to unpack. I think it's interesting because my perspective of it when I first walked in as a visitor, I would come to the museum as a visitor, and I remember walking right by them going, there's a lot of history in there that I can't. I was with my kids and think, I'm not going to think about that right now. Now it's when I was an employee going into the room, now I'm thinking the first thing that I noticed were the guns for some reason, right? We're coming in with our own story. And so I was thinking guns. It seemed a bit violent to me, but understanding, and I have such trust in the Museum of Science. I live here, I work here, I live here practically. And I was thinking there's gotta be a rich history to this. Why the museum? So you were thinking, why is this? I was thinking something really important is coming from this room. Lori, what are some of your thoughts on this room?
Well, like 𝗖𝗂𝗃, I would question why it's here in a science museum. But since it is here, it makes me think, how should we understand this now? And is there some learning that can come out of this? In part, I had to try to think more about what is a trophy room anyway? How should we understand this? And this is a historic trophy room, but of course, there are still trophy rooms. So I did a little research. I don't usually read sporting classics daily, but I did. A trophy room is the culmination of a lifetime. This is from last year. A culmination of a lifetime of sport and should evoke the same level of joy as the hunt. So it makes me think from a modern perspective that our eyes about the joy of the hunt, but maybe that's something that we bring to that as particular demographic. There are still hunters there. Big game hunting is still something people engage in. It was fascinating to me, though, that someone who makes trophy rooms in this same issue said, what we really do in making a trophy room for someone is help people tell their stories. We create a place where they can display the things they love: art, taxidermy, firearms, artifacts, or books, all of which we see in the Colby Room. So the notion of a trophy room, and how should we understand this historically? How should we understand it now? It evokes all of this trophy hunting, and it brings up a lot of emotions for those of us who work in science museums and are concerned about the conservation of the animals that we see there on the walls as trophies. But then it was a different time, it was a different spirit, it was a different mentality. I think there are things we could unpack and try to understand how this came to be and what it tells us about a man and a whole demographic.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Love the research. I think that's wonderful. We also did research here. We have a research and evaluation team at the museum, and they had done some collection of some data of visitors that were coming into the museum. And what I found interesting was when they listed some words from the participants, which were about 40 visitors that were interviewed and surveyed. 59% were white and Caucasian, white 55% identified as male, and the average age was 24. When showed a list of words, they talked about curiosity and being surprised. They also had some visitors who were specifically identified as Black and African American, and there was a word that came to them of uneasy, and just understanding the different perspectives. We also had high school students come, and Fenway High School students were coming in, and we had 16 high school students come in, and this part I found interesting was about the artifacts that what they found very interesting were animals that they didn't know existed. There were animals that they didn't know what kind of animals they were, and they thought that was interesting as well. So we have some questions here on Slido and some comments. James, should we go into some Slido? Is that okay to go into some Slido comments? Yeah. Okay. One question is here is, could an artifact like the doors be copied, like a plaster mold or a duplicate carving, so the original could be sent back if this was something that was important to the people or the country of origin? I thought that was an interesting question. And that does happen oftentimes. We do see in museums, they say this is a replica because the original is someplace else, either traveling, or is that something that you have done work before in some of your areas as well? Lori, is that something that museums do?
Yes, those doors are big for that, but museums have done this, whether it's scanned and 3D printed, or in some cases you might go back to the community of origin to see whether there's someone today who would carve you a new version of these, and that would be a way to connect better with the community. There are options. There are ways to do this.
Great. Well, we have some questions here too, and just making sure that we are on time. Everything's good. Okay, good. I love the thumbs up from James. It always makes me feel better. I'm hoping, Lori, back to you. I'm hoping if you can share a little bit about the work that you've led at AMNH around reinterpreting some of the exhibits in your institution.
Sure. We have all older museums have a share of exhibits that we would consider problematic. Here's one that for us has been an issue for some time. This is part of our Theodore Roosevelt Memorial, which is at the American Museum of Natural History because Theodore Roosevelt was the governor of New York, and when New York wanted to build a memorial to him, it landed at our museum, and they created this scene, largely apocryphal, of an encounter between the governor. Here, I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better. That's Peter Stuyvesant on the left with one of his Dutch men, and three members of the 𝗥𝗪, a group within the Lenape community. This scene purports to be kind of in honor of Theodore Roosevelt's Dutch ancestors, although Roosevelt's no direct descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, so there was a stretch there to start with. And I think what we see is not a scene of equal meeting equal, but clearly a scene in which Native people seem to be in tribute to the governor. They are bringing tobacco and wampum. You see Stuyvesant with his hand outstretched. This scene had existed since 1939 in our museum, untouched, and we wrestled with what to do with it. We thought maybe we should just cover it up or take it away. Often that's what museums do, is we just take things away that become problems. We update them in a way that we think would be better. In this case, we thought maybe we should try something different. And what we did was we annotated the scene. Mm-hmm. And we thought that was important in part because we felt we had perpetuated a scene that was in fact false. And I realize you can't probably all read what it says under reconsidering this scene, but it says essentially this encounter is intended to celebrate the Dutch founders of Old New York, but the scene offers only stereotypical representations and ignores how complex and violent colonization was for Native people. There's also smaller annotations that pick up many of the details in the scene that are not truthful. I'm not sure this is an end point for us. Maybe this is an intermediary stage. I think for a museum to say, essentially, we perpetuated a stereotype, we were wrong, is a difficult step for us. As a science museum, we pride ourselves on delivering the information accurately. But we felt like we couldn't really move on from this until we acknowledged what we had done. And we did this in consultation, several of us, with someone from the Lenape community, an expert from the Lenape community who helped us think through how we would approach this. So this is an instance where we had a problematic exhibit and we left it up and we addressed it. But it's not the only problematic exhibit, so we have more. This is, and you can see even from the title is problematic, the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt, and yet there are three people here. We see Roosevelt on horseback, but we see two unidentified people below him, and I think below is the key word here. We see on our right-hand side an unidentified African man, probably East African, we think from the details that we can investigate, and a Plains native man on the other side. Why the sculptor chose to do this exactly, we don't know. There are different interpretations from the time as to what that meant. But for us, the statue had long sat right in our front entrance. It's right where everyone comes through. And it had been there also since the time of the diorama, more or less. This was when the Roosevelt Memorial was built. And so we thought a lot about how we might address this. And we were not the only ones thinking about this, I should add. There had been protests there since the 1970s. So by the time we thought about it, there had been protests of various sorts for 50 years. And as I've understood here, staff were unhappy as well as people outside the museum. So what we did was we convened a great lot of experts of different types. We convened artists and historians, native historians. We brought in a member of the group that had protested most vigorously on the front steps. And we also talked to a lot of people on the street, because we felt like this is sitting in front. I should add that the museum did not own the statue. The city of New York owned the statue. So we also felt like it was not so easy for us as a museum to decide whether it should stay up or come down. So we created a 17-minute video by a very talented filmmaker who worked with us, 𝗖𝘂𝗹𝗯𝘆, to listen to how all of our experts felt about the statue. We took that video and we included it in an exhibit that was straight through the front doors called Addressing the Statue. And unlike in the diorama, where we had a very clear singular institutional point of view, we had no singular view here. The whole idea was that there were many different ways to understand this, including people who thought we should keep it up, people who thought we should take it down, people who thought we should add context. And we lived with that for a while. And as I said, it was complicated in part because the museum didn't own the statue. But this went up in 2019. The summer of 2020 helped the nation and the world think a lot more about issues of representation, issues of justice. And in the end, we acknowledged that it was very difficult to take that treatment that we had at the diorama, where you really couldn't look at the diorama without seeing what I would call our intervention. But it was quite different at the statue. We had small signage, but there's really no way to interpret that we could find to really help people who walked by, who went by in a cab, looked out their window and saw this. And in the end, the museum asked the city to remove the statue, and we took the statue down. I should add that we still have a statue of Theodore Roosevelt inside the museum. He's seated, he's alone, and he is still the conservation president whose father helped found our museum. So this was a complicated piece for us. And the thing I think that was most interesting to me was how I think the exhibit helped everyone in the museum think a lot harder about what we had on our front steps. And I think that if anything, hearing the voices of all of these different people and all these different perspectives moved the dial for us institutionally.
I love that. Do you happen to know where the statue is right now? It just looks like it just went.
Yes, it just anti-gravity drifted away. No, it is in storage right now, and it is planned to go to a Roosevelt Presidential Library that is still under construction. They have asked for it.
I find that fascinating.
Where they would interpret it.
I find it fascinating that I didn't also realize that the statue didn't belong to the museum.
Right.
I find all those connections fascinating. So I'm going to now bring this to you, 𝗖𝗂𝗹𝗆.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lori, for that. About what role can community collaborators, right, play? And this is a great example. And just hearing the work that you do with the museum, the work that you do in many different areas, that'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, I think the key role is agency, because the way museums are set up, they're set up in such a way where there are specific roles people play to curate everything, right? And there are all these gatekeepers that determine what information gets presented and how it's presented. So when you bring in collaborators from the community partners, it gives voice to the community, and it gives the community the legitimacy that we're taught that only the museum has, right? And so, yes, that was a great example earlier, seeing all of these people speak up against the statue and how that kind of signified that, hey, the museum is here to serve the community. You're here to help the community, not the other way around, right? It's a more asset-based approach to understanding the collective narratives and experiences of the people there, and give the community a chance to own their own narratives, right? In a space that they've been excluded and marginalized from. So, yeah.
I love that. And that is what we're trying to do here at the Museum of Science, certainly. And our mission and our vision is to bring science to everybody, and science belongs to everyone. Yeah. And the reason why I'm here too, personally and both professionally, is to be part of that. And I love the word to curate, to be part of that conversation, to be part of that understanding of how to get there. We have time for questions. We have some questions on Slido as well. If we also have 2 mics, right, James? And we can do some additional questions. But I'd really like to also just talk a little bit about the importance of what the Museum of Science is doing regarding this collaboration and knowing our history. We're really starting to take a look at working with our staff, and we're doing a lot of culturally responsive programming. The museum is going on, and we have some audacious and innovative goals. We're going to go digital. We want to be in classrooms. And for us, it's not just about the Museum of Science, of course. Tim and I would love for you all to come here regularly on a beautiful day and on a rainy day. But we also want to make sure that science is for everyone. And it's about the love of science. And we want to play a role in that for you all. So here we have a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging group, a committee with our staff. We also have a group of about 20 or 25 people that James and I co-lead and collaborate on, and looking at how to do culturally responsive programming here and now. What are we doing, and what are we doing in the future? And of course, we want to look at what the community is thinking about the Museum of Science, and how to bring them in. And we have to understand ourselves too on how we're going to get there. So that's really important to us.
Can I add one more thing?
You can add
I meant to say about community partnerships, because you just reminded me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When I had the opportunity to do my own show here with the Museum of Science, there were a lot of people that came into the space that hadn't before and wouldn't have considered coming. And I think that's another pivotal role that community partnerships play, because by having someone in this artistic space that they can connect with and they see themselves in, they felt like they could have ownership over the space that they were coming into. Yeah. So I just wanted to add that, please.
Thank you. So what's next for the Museum of Science? And so let's take a look at some of these questions. Did we fix our live stream? Okay, great. There were some questions about live stream. Someone had mentioned that they really appreciate, this is a comment, they really appreciate learning more about the story behind the elephant doors. So thank you for that. And that was really insightful. There's a question about, can you go into more detail around the rationale for accepting the Colby Room in the 50s? Was it largely tied to endowment and it being secured that way? The relationship, Dr. Brad Washburn is the founder of the museum. And so there was a relationship between the two of them. And so we're finding documentation and learning more documentation about what the other knew about the other. So there was a collaboration. So that when the time came to accept a gift it was a gift that will help the museum grow. So that's the way it was thought of at the time. I don't know if James or Tim, if you want to add anything to that.
That's about right.
That's about right. Great. And we're learning more, and that's why we're here. Another question is, how often do museums revisit permanent or very long-term exhibits to determine if they still reflect the message the museum wants to tell? I really love that question. Thank you for that. Lori, do you want to help us with that?
Never often enough. It's a constant challenge in museums to create an exhibit, and it's like the story about painting the bridge. By the time you get to the far end, it's time to go back and start again. But brick and mortar exhibits are kind of slow, concrete processes, and I think we need to think more about how to make exhibits more rapidly updatable, how to invite more perspectives in, how to think more fluidly about what we present as a permanent exhibit. And there's no question that museums think about this a lot, but in our older buildings with our older exhibits, and sometimes with old infrastructure that involves everything from old wiring in the walls to what the paint and asbestos is in the ceiling, it's a challenge to update.
Yeah.
And I think we really have to confront this as museums, because we watch as people come in and they're here to learn and to see what we have to show them. And it's our responsibility to find ways to keep bringing the new information forward and all the voices that were excluded into the conversation.
Right. Certainly the same for us here, and thinking about revisiting and looking. And we're really proud of the work that we have here and the exhibits that we have, but we don't do it enough. But we're certainly looking at how to be culturally responsive and how to be more inclusive with the community and bringing in the community to do it together too when we're looking at our exhibits. There was another great question here. Anyone want to come up to the mic while I'm searching for that other great question? Okay. How can the museum address the responsibility of promoting white mediocrity, as 𝗖cie had mentioned? How can it properly contextualize colonialism and power dynamics of knowledge creation and legitimize within that single exhibit? That's 𝗖cie or?
It's a loaded
Yes, it is.
question.
It's a great question. Loaded, great question.
Yes, thank you for asking that. I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. I think it's something that is very layered. But I do think that one example we saw earlier is having accountability, right? And naming something for what it is. I think that's very powerful. Being able to acknowledge what a space is, so that when you're walking into a space and you're feeling some type of way, it's not that you're dealing with these emotions in isolation, right? I also think that it's really important to... Never mind, I was going to say something I don't think I should say, so I'm going to point it to somebody else.
That's how the conversations go. We think, we process.
Yes,
Right.
I'm going to process. I'm going to come back to me.
I would jump in to say, well, when I think of all the story that 𝗖𝗪 told about the doors and how layered that is, how they are a portal, if you will, onto colonization, onto white people and Europeans in Africa. These are exhibits that we don't often have in museums, and we don't talk about these things out in the open, right? So I think we shouldn't live with this room just as a celebration of trophy hunting. Mm-hmm. But I think it does give us an opportunity to talk about all sorts of things that are really important to talk about now, and that we used to think didn't belong in museums, didn't belong in schools, weren't the way we all were taught. And maybe we should take it for what it is, which is an opportunity to talk about conservation of endangered animals, an opportunity to talk about the ongoing effects of colonization in Africa, to talk about all of these issues that we need some springboard for these conversations. and something that's visually interesting. People come to museums to see things, but museums want our visitors to think harder. And we have to meet people in those conversations to set the stage for conversations. And they can't just be one-sided conversations. Right. You know, if we're going to have a conversation about trophy hunting, we need to hear from a trophy hunter. We need to hear from everybody in the room, because it's not going to work for us just to have our singular museum perspective any longer.
Yeah. And
Agreed.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to add, because I remember what I wanted to say, is just that in addition to thinking about what stories being told, what stories aren't being told, and finding ways to create spaces for those stories so that we have what? A complete story.
Right.
And,
We're going to hold on to that one because that's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And because some of the equity consulting work that I've done there's been this constant issue of like, okay, what do we do when the people that support us think a certain way? If we change, then what's going to happen, right? So we have to begin to thinking about like, what are we setting ourselves up for? What assumptions are we making about the people that enter into our space and where we're getting our support from?
I think that for me, one of the questions about this particular room and that raises is that the communities from where some of these objects and the places from where some of these objects in the room come from are not here are not co-present with us in terms of physical space in North America, in the United States, in Boston. They live in different part of the world, in Africa. And I think you mentioned something about the fact that the effects of colonialism continue to pervade the lives of the people from whom these people came from, the descendants of these individuals. Yes. And the landscapes which were ruptured as a result of this. And those are continuing today. And those asymmetries of power that were established in the colonial period between Europeans and non-Europeans remains a central part of the global landscape today. And how do we think about that asymmetry of power? And that's the issue, is that I wanted to show the pictures of those individuals on the screen because those are the people who, created those objects. And their presence is not felt in the museum. What we have is a story of a collector and his collection. And I think that that's one story. But here we have the people who produce those objects, live with them. But also the taxidermic animals which are on the wall, they have a life, they have a history, they have a presence. They're co-present with those communities from where they came from. So I think that is an important aspect of this, which is problematic. These are problematic and difficult truths. And one of those is also the violence that was undertaken. I mean, those punitive expeditions were not benign acts of, this was a David and Goliath situation. I mean, you had, massive boats with, armies on them coming to ostensibly a stone-built settlement and eradicating it overnight. I mean, these are not easy stories to tell. And I think that is part of the question that I always ask in the classroom is, what are the legacies of those histories? And in effect, this is one of the legacies in this room. And how do we now think about how to explain that to the population? Yes, they're beautiful doors. And that beauty cannot be, I think it would be difficult to replicate it. But
Agreed.
But I do think one of the most interesting opportunities here is to go back to those communities and to see what those doors mean to them, what those objects mean to them. There are a lot of Maasai objects in that room. There are lots of other communities who are living today who could who could be participating in this process, like you described in terms of the community outreach that you've done with those. And I would love to, so for example, see a whole group of Lamu-based or East African coastal carvers come to Boston
Yeah.
and talk about their work and, think about, celebrate this incredibly talented artist.
That'd be amazing.
That would be an incredible kind of work and intervention that could really start a new conversation across the globe in the way that you started conversations in New York with people who walked by.
That's great.
And more curations by the people, the communities that need to be represented that are missing, right? Because I feel like even if we bring other people in, the people who are always making the money on staff for some reason, they're never representing the communities that need to be remembered. So
We have a question over here. If you don't mind coming a little closer to the mic, if you can.
Because it's high for me.
Oh. It's high for me too.
Okay. Because this is the Museum of Science, so I have visited the museum several times, and I wonder whether there is let's say, a political correct filter that have been applied to what exhibits and what kind of sciences, even hard sciences, are really shown in the museum, for instance. There are many kinds of really science that have been applied in a very, let's say, negative way. I'm going to just take one that had already both sides, really, let's say the nuclear power and that kind of thing. I don't think I see that in here. And I certainly, and that showed up in all kind of press and so on, but people seem to politely say, you know what I mean, kind of thing. I think that a museum of science could be a space where those topics are explored. And then they are more than this, And why did we go into other, let's say, chemistry, for instance, also have many negative applications or lack of exploring the applications. Why do we have to learn 10, 20, 30 years after we use certain things? And do we really, even when we learn about the negative effects, are we really pursuing the science to remedy it, to fix it, and that kind of thing? So that is my question.
Great, thank you so much. Is your question, let me just rephrase it, is your question asking, are we as a museum looking at other ways and other areas?
I am asking, are we really avoiding that? If someone organizes an exhibit or choose a topic of exhibit, or do we say, hey, traditionally we do this and don't ask other questions, all right? So if we are really a scientific mind, usually we say, let's be open and look at the topic and see how can we do better science, right?
Right.
And how do we encourage people who pursue science to what kind of mindset should they apply, right? So,
thank you, sure.
For instance, ChatGPT now, people say, stop, but why do we stop now?
Surely.
Why Elon Musk, when he was cooperating with OpenAI, do not put that in the condition when he started? When he put his millions in, saying, I want you to do that too.
Yeah, well, we're certainly, with science, we're certainly staying curious and having an open mind. And we're certainly,
But the point that is not here, meaning that some mind had been closed.
Sure. That's a great point. And thank you very much for coming and asking that question. Certainly at the Museum of Science, a lot of what we're talking about is science at the pace of change. And so we really want to make sure that we understand and we're open and we're having these conversations, as I mentioned before, not just exhibits that we have now, but future exhibits as well. So we're certainly staying curious and open-minded. It is complex and understanding how do we do that and how do we do that effectively. And I'll end by saying, how do we do that? By telling the whole story, because that's how we started. Thank you so much. We are at time. I have thoroughly enjoyed sitting. It's an honor. I go back into this everything that I've learned this evening. A big thank you to James, a big thank you to Subspace, and a big thank you to 𝗤𝘂𝗏 for being here as well. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we will be here for a little bit as you exit the building. And James is going to end with a few other, as an announcement, conversations. Oh, I'm sorry. James and I are a little comfortable with each other. Hold on, I'm sorry. There were questions here that we did not get to. And I just want to say there were questions about what is the museum going to do? What are some of the endowments? Will the museum return some of the artifacts? So there were so many great questions. Certainly we'll look at them as a group and as co-creators and collaborators. But just to let you know, the museum is prepared to do what we need to do once we've learned all of the information that we have in front of us. We are still learning and we are growing together, and we'll certainly see what the next steps are together. So thank you for those great questions. James, would you like to come up and end this?
Take two. Let's have a hand, please, for our panel. Thank you all so much for being here. These are important conversations, challenging and complex conversations, so we appreciate our partnership with all of you. Before we let you go, we have a very special guest that we want to welcome up. Tonight you heard about the reinterpretation work that's happening here at the museum, as well as decolonization work that's happening across institutions. And we have our friends from Arts Emerson here tonight who are going to talk a little bit about their upcoming decolonization programming in case you all want to continue to be a part of these conversations that are happening across the city of Boston. So please join me in welcoming 𝗤𝘂𝗏 Pinoy, the Director of Artistic Programming at Arts Emerson.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our friends at the Museum of Science for giving us, very brief, I promise, moment at the mic, and thank you all for your remarks tonight. So yes, I'm 𝗤𝘂𝗏 Pinoy, she, hers. I'm also Laguna Pueblo and Cherokee, 𝗖cie𝗹𝗯𝘆. And at Arts Emerson, we've been having, even before my time, beginning a year and a half ago, conversations around decolonization and what that means to artistic practice, and what stories that we have on stage, and how are we restorying American history to actually more fully represent the complete truth. So with that, I wanted to take a moment to invite you all to 𝗖𝗂𝗋𝗆 that is happening next week at the Paramount Center. So this is with Cherokee actress and artist 𝗖𝗂𝗋𝗆 Studi. If you know Wes Studi from Last of the Mohicans, or basically any movie with an Indigenous person in it, he was probably in it. This is his niece, 𝗖𝗂𝗋, and this is a play about 𝗖𝗂𝗋's experience as a contemporary Cherokee woman walking the Trail of Tears with her father. So it is a very frank and funny, I promise, look at what it means to be actually an Indigenous person today in this context, because as I'm sure many of our panelists would agree, colonization is not an event. It's not a one-time event. It's a structure. We still live in this country in a settler-colonized state. And so having voices like 𝗖𝗂𝗋 really be able to step forward with outstanding artistry and tell their own story is so important. So thank you all for the opportunity to hear a little bit about how we're thinking about decolonization at Arts Emerson in our work, and I really encourage you to come find me. And I have a little flyer with a discount if you're able to join us next week, and there's other events I can tell you about. But I'll just wrap by saying huge thanks to the Museum of Science, and we're really excited about some future partnerships we have in the works, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you, 𝗤𝘂𝗏. All right, thank you all for coming out tonight. We have members of our research and evaluation team who are down here. They have surveys. We appreciate you taking just a few moments to fill those out. We want your feedback on this conversation tonight. It's going to help inform the future of this work. And our panelists are down here. They want to continue the conversation with you as well. Thank you. Have a wonderful night.